Hello everyone. So this week's readings all come from the Victorian period, and as you probably know from reading the introduction, this is a time when Britain saw itself as this moral and political center of the world. And so literature wasn't just, serialized entertainment. It was used as a tool to help in justifying the idea of empire and regulate society. And so as we go through the reading for this week, we should think about who gets to speak / write, and what should one speak / write about, and what social roles are being reinforced or challenged. Now, the introduction reflects a dominant Victorian belief that Britain had a responsibility, almost a divine duty, to rule other nations. And this is obvious when you look at the picture you have of Queen Victoria gifting the Bible to an African ambassador. And so this idea of empire was often justified using moral language, the language of civilization or the civilization mission, progress, order, and Christianity. So this way of thinking allowed for economic exploitation and political domination to appear legitimate and ethical. So for example, when you read the Vitae Lampada by Newbold and then Joseph Chamberlain's speech, notice how the moral language is used to cover this idea of power. So we can say that the imperial texts, whether literary or political, often assume that English values are universal and superior. Colonized peoples are rarely allowed to speak for themselves. So we should always pay attention to what is missing from the text. Pay attention not only to the text's obvious commitments, but also to its omissions, to the things that it represses. So this repression tells us that the Victorian confidence we see in political documents often masks anxiety about maintaining control. Okay, so let's begin with George Eliot. She was born as Mary Ann Evans. She obviously chose a male pen name so that her work could be taken seriously in a literary space that was dominated by male authorship. So Eliot was deeply engaged with philosophy, religion, and realism, and we can even say that she built an entire career that in and of itself can be considered a critique of Victorian gender expectations. So in silly novels by lady novelists, she criticizes popular fiction written by women. Now, not because she thought that women shouldn't write, but because she thought that they should write, but in a more intellectual manner. So she offers a critique of several novels written by women, and the common thing between them, it seems to me, is their emphasis on some kind of sentimental moralizing. Eliot didn't really appreciate this commitment to writing that is overly emotional and unrealistic. Now, it's clear that Eliot was trying to establish a space for women to be taken seriously as intellectual and artistic individuals, and she wanted them to move away from this collective image that society kind of enforced on them. So we can say that Eliot is negotiating a very difficult position. She wants women to succeed in a male-dominated literary space, but without simply imitating men. Okay, now moving on to Elizabeth Browning. It's worth keeping in mind that she had a spine injury when she was a child, and so she lived her life as, chronically an invalid. And I think in the third sonnet, the allusion to the broken violin is an echo of that injury. She's skeptical about Robert's love for her because she thinks of herself as this broken instrument that a musician would only be fleetingly interested in. So that's a very tragic and self-conscious moment in that poem. But as you know, despite the serious injury, she managed to develop a very powerful literary voice. Okay, so sonnets from the Portuguese are intensely personal. as you can probably tell. They chart Browning's emotional adventure from self-doubt to love, and at the same time, they challenge Victorian expectations of female modesty and silence. Writing openly about desire and emotional dependence was a very risky thing for a woman poet to do at the time. Okay, so gradually through the 4 sonnets, we come to see love not as weakness, but as a source of strength and selfhood. So pay attention to how the speaker negotiates power and equality within love, especially in a society where women were expected to be passive. I especially like how we can actually feel the gradual strengthening of her character and self-image through the sonnets. Okay, now moving on to Christina Rossetti. She lived a quiet life, but she wrote some of the most unsettling poetry. Now, this peculiar style is in part because she was influenced by her brother, Dante Rossetti, who led a very bohemian lifestyle and introduced her to his pre-Raphaelite circle of artists. Now, she had strong religious beliefs, and obviously they shaped her views on temptation and sacrifice and female desire. She never married, by the way. She rejected several proposals for religious reasons. Okay, now Goblin Market looks like a children's poem, but it really isn't. Obviously, it's dealing with themes of forbidden desire and consumer temptation, which was, becoming a huge thing in Victorian times. And we have also the themes of female solidarity and sisterhood. Now, as a text, the poem kind of resists simple moral interpretation. It has been read as religious allegory, a sexual allegory even, and an economic critique. So unlike many Victorian narratives, salvation in this poem comes through sisterhood. It doesn't come through romantic love or male intervention. So Rossetti is effectively imagining a world where women can actually rescue one another, which really challenges the dominant narratives of sin and punishment and female salvation, which was usually carried out by a male. And this is, by the way, something we have seen a parody of in the novella we have read last week by Jane Austen. Okay, so across these different literary texts, we see Victorian writers working within a restrictive system while trying to push against it in very subtle ways. And this system includes aspects like imperial authority, literary gatekeeping, and gender norms. So the invitation here is that we should try to read in a critical and skeptical way, and especially pay attention to not only to what the text actively says, but to the text's omissions, right? What it actively represses. Okay, so in short, we should focus on the assumptions hidden in the background of these literary texts. Okay, so that's it for this week. I'm going to leave you with these questions to think about as you read, and I will see you next time. Bye.